Hey everybody, welcome
Hey,
to Hush Harbor Lab and our Blue Bottle series. We are a little early and a little late and somewhere in the middle, but we are here today. So, yes, we're here. We have an exciting guest. We're so excited to have Mr. Tom Jones on today. So, Adaye, why don't you start us off? But I'm Amina McIntyre, and this is Adaye
I'm
Moon.
a
Yes,
diver.
yes, yes. And so we're going to just kind of get started in just a second. But Daya, tell us about Hush Harbor and what we do and why this series.
So, Hush Harbor is a new play development laboratory focusing on Black experimental work by Black artists in Atlanta, GA. So, we're here to help cultivate a safe and brave space for artists to create new work. And so, a part of this Blue Bottle series has been talking to people that we know and respect about new play development, especially from the perspective of Black artists and the tradition of Black arts.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, so that's really it. And so we are also doing some other work, and we have some other exciting stuff. We've been talking and trying to figure some things out, but we have some other things coming. But we do want to mention, of course, that this series is sponsored in part by the Fulton County Arts Culture, one of the grants. The Fulton County Board of Commissions has generously given us a little bit of funding to make sure that we can do some things that work and kind of further theater and make sure that we can help, make sure that the artists can eat a little bit off of some of the little stuff. So we're so excited that we can do those things because that is very important. This is the livelihood of the work. But anyway, so we are grateful to them and grateful to everybody. But we want to go ahead and get Mr. Tom Jones on, get started. So if you all would just welcome. We're going to kind of pull them on in.
Yes.
Yay!
That's how it works. The wonders of technology. Yeah.
The magic.
In the age of COVID. Yeah.
Wonders
the thing
of
we're learning to do.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. I was working on a film project just shortly, last week or so. And because of COVID, et cetera, I was working on learning how to make blood. You know, you get into one of these projects where you think you're just the writer, director, and it's like, oh, no, you're doing props. Oh, no, you're doing set. Oh, no, you're doing. This is the age of COVID. We can't have all these people in here. So you want
we all gonna learn.
You're going to make it, right? So there I am. I have something new to add to my resume. So anyway.
No, which is the perfect segue. So for those of you who don't know Tom Jones, I mean, Tom Jones is pretty much does every damn thing in the theater. Producer, director, writer, actor, a man who's done a lot of new play development work. And Tom is also known as the collector of all the checks because of all the work that Tom does.
Listen.
Why am I so broke? Why am I still broke? So, the brokeology, I can give you the science of being broke.
So, as being the master collector of all the checks, Tom, can you tell us a little bit about your journey as an artist?
Yes.
Well, I mean, my journey started, I really was a descendant of the Black arts movement of the 1960s. And so my mentors and folks I studied with were people like Sonia Sanchez and Amiri Baraka and James Baldwin, and had the privilege of actually being in their company and being mentored by them in a place called Amherst College, which had a 5-college system. And so all of these, it was this amazing, it's almost like where all these activist artists went to recover in the 70s. So Baldwin was there, and Vishnu Wood was there, and Max Roach was there. They started the first actually could get a degree program in jazz. You had Paul Carter Harrison was on the staff. Sonia Sanchez was there. James Baldwin. I mean, it was literally, for some reason, the stopping ground of everybody. We had the former Minister of Economics for Ghana, Nana Nketiah, was there teaching economics and Black studies. So when you went there and developed into the Black Studies department, you had this opportunity to study with not only those who were creating the movement, but those who were also recovering from whatever wounds they had in the 1960s. So that was kind of my mentorship. So when I left college in '78, when I graduated, my sense was, one, having been born and raised in New York and growing up on NEC, and also then having studied with these Black arts disciples, saying that our notion was institution building, that what we should be doing is providing a means by which we could have art within within a community that served the needs, interests, point of view of that community. And so we were part of a second generation of theaters. Again, when I started Jumanji with Marsha Jackson and my family in 1978, there were literally, in New York alone, 140 African-American theaters.
Wow.
There was something called the Black Theater Alliance. We were one of 11 African-American theater companies in Atlanta alone, because they were being nurtured and fostered by the work of Maynard Jackson, who became Atlanta's first Black mayor, and created something called the Department of Cultural Affairs, of which Michael Lomax was the chairperson over. And so their whole thrust was creating art in communities. The reason why there's a Center for Puppetry Arts, the reason why there's a Euclid Art Center, is because what they had as an initiative were to create old school buildings that had been closed down and turn them over to the arts institutions and artists, so that they could then use that as a repository for all kinds of work. So the Euclid Arts comes out of that. The Center for Puppetry Arts comes out of that. There was a place called the Neighborhood Arts Center on Georgia Avenue that has since burned down. That was the home of people like LaTanya Richardson and Samuel Jackson and Spike Lee and all of those folks that came into our classes, but were able to use that as an incubator for their work. It was actually one of our first homes where we were able to teach classes in acting, and they would give us performance space. So that was the climate in the late 1970s. So we were all thinking about ourselves as institution builders. And certainly, the kind of work we were doing coming from the Black arts, thing was that you take art to the people. But secondly, that you create a menu and a wealth of kind of artistic projects. So our whole sensibility was about the creation and development of new work, and not simply from the vantage point of playwrights, but also approaches to the work, multidisciplinary work, bringing in artists in terms of collective and collaborative, and speaking how does Black music and Black poetry and Black theatrical voices, how do they kind of work in this gumbo in terms of performance and a style? We also had to do that because we had to establish an identity for ourselves that was different from the 10 other Black theaters that were doing a whole host of work. They were doing the traditional, they were doing Philip Hayes Dean. They were doing, I'm trying to think of all of the writers, the Lonnie Elders, the Sam Art Williams, all that canon of work that came out of the Negro Ensemble Company. They were doing that work. Proposition Theater, which was another theater that was actually in residency at the Memorial Arts Center at the Alliance, they were doing this interesting kind of taking Faulkner and taking, aside from the risky canon of Black work, they were also taking, white titles and creating these Black adaptations to it. So we had to kind of just create an identity for ourselves that was just in terms of what we believed in and what we wanted to do, but also that was distinct from the 10 other companies that were there. As those companies began to winnow away in the early to mid 80s, then we found ourselves dealing with the brunt of responsibility of not only new work, but also the traditional canon. So we took on the show like Black Nativity, because Just Us, which was a theater that was next door to us, they were the ones that did Black Nativity every year. There was a need for it. They were no longer in business. So we said, it'll become part of the canon of what we do. That's kind of the genesis of where we started. And I think we've also always tried to be, nurture and be a home for not only styles of performance, but also a home for playwrights. So we were a home for Jeff Stetson, who was the author of The Meeting. We did his Fraternity. We actually commissioned him to do a piece on the life of Adam Clayton Powell that George Faison directed. We were the home for a young brother who was really hot at that point called Alonzo Lamont, who did that series He-Man Ball and a bunch of other things, who then went on to write for Different World out of LA as a result of that play. So we were an incubator for a lot of artists, and hopefully a home for a lot of artists. And with that came a lot of challenges, because when there were 11, then there could be all these distinct kind of variety in the marketplace. When you became one, then you began to take on the challenges of trying to be all things for all people. Right. And in that sense, you begin to, in a sense, if nothing else, I have lived through why there should be diversity of institutions in Black art, that there can never be a one-stop shop. I
Can
know
you
that's a long
talk?
answer to your question, but
I mean, yeah, he just gave us them Atlanta Black Theater history in less than 15 minutes.
Right, but can I ask you before we move forward? Can you can you define for people what it means to be an incubator for the arts? What do you, when you say that phrase, what exactly are you talking about, and how does that work in terms of new develop? I mean, especially developing new plays.
I think it's exactly what you guys have said at the very outset of being a safe space, of being a place where artists can come in and not be afraid to fail. That all too often what happens with new work now is that it's put under the microscope in front of an audience before it's ready to see an audience. And so you have these kind of producing challenges and pressures to make this the play that audiences will buy, which may not be in the best interest of the artist that's developing it. That what you try and develop for us was a process, and where is the artist in process? Do they need a reading? Do they need a workshop? Ultimately, with the idea of saying we're going to do a full production, but not saddling the artist with the pressure of a full production at the outset. Where are you in your, in terms of your own creative evolution with response to a particular play, and how do we nurture that? All too often, what we we knew we wanted to produce, and we were a company that was built on new work. So that was always a foregone conclusion, that the only reason why we're spending time with this is because we believe in the artist, and we believe in the process, and we believe in what they can produce. And we already know we're going to make a commitment to producing it fully. So to that degree, then we had a certain flexibility of when do you think the artist will be ready? And can have a real conversation, because the artist already knew, I'm not trying to, rush the process. I already know I have a home here. I already know this is going to get done. It's going to be done in the season, second show, fourth show, or the next year. And when it's ready to be up. So then it took some of the pressure off of the playwright and we were doing lots of musicals, because that's kind of what we built our world on, was this interdisciplinary work that also morphed into doing a lot of musicals. So when you're pulling together composers and librettists and and playwrights and book writers, and which goes first, the chicken of the egg? Does the composer need to go first and then the book writer come behind, or is this a project really out of the head of the book writer, as in the case of Jeff Stetson and the Adam Clayton Powell piece? I want to do a piece on Adam Clayton Powell. Find me a composer I can work with. And so we did. We went to a few composers before we settled on, and he was able to settle on the one that he could trust and that could actually do the job at the speed at which he could work. He worked really quickly. And the first composer we kind of married him to was somebody who needed to marinate, needed time. And so that marriage just didn't work, because he's used to LA, he's used to Hollywood, he's used to cranking out a script every week. We're going to tell him, so, he said, here's my book, here's the lyrics, let's go. It's like, okay, we needed somebody as a composer who could run at the same speed that he was writing. So those are just a lot of, I think that the notion of what you are as an incubator changes. There's no one-stop shop, and there's no one-size-fits-all. It really adjusts to what the needs of the artist, what they need in terms of fulfilling their kind of, artistic sensibility and agenda.
Right. And getting back to the whole idea of Black institutions and the importance of Black institutions. I mean, because I always tell people that I was blessed to come up at an HBCU with some amazing professors who are all working professionals. And then my first professional gig was at Jamandi. And that and those things have shaped the rest of my artistic career and practice. How important are those institutional mentorships, and how necessary are they now, especially in this current climate where there's so few Black institutions?
I think it's kind of indispensable. It's like, I'll answer your question just indirectly and come back to it, on point. In 1984, 83 or 84, we were the first company in the country to ever do an August Wilson play outside of Broadway. Oh, wow. Literally 6 weeks from when it closed on Broadway, we opened it. The very show that Thomas Byrd, rest in peace and in power, the one that he was nominated for a Tony Award, he originated that role in our company in 1983. No one had heard of August Wilson outside of Broadway and Yale. We petitioned for the rights. Literally, I saw it the last week and knew it was closing. And when I got back to Atlanta a week later, asked for the rights, and they gave it to us. Jettison 3 years later, after Fences and Pulitzer, we couldn't find an August Wilson play.
Right.
We no longer. They now became part of the canon of these larger white institutions. So what we began to recognize very quickly was that, one, we were going to have to create an identity and a usefulness for artists that weren't going to be the artists that were famous, because their agenda was going to be something else, and necessarily so. They were going to look at, how do I get the biggest bang for the buck? What we could be a home to were the artist that was emerging and in development. The artist that wasn't going to get the position, was not going to be part of the whim of predominantly white institutions. And let's face it, the Alliances of the world, the Guthries, the Arenas, etc., their mission is not to do Black work 24/7. It is to include it as part of the canon of their work, but that's not what their function, nor should it be, nor should we be asking them to be that.
Right.
What we should be is creating in our own minds, in our own head, what our aesthetic is, and developing the generation of artists that can speak to that aesthetic and the perpetuation of that, and giving them a place, as you say, a safe space to work. And if that is the fundamental mission of, it's the same thing that HCBUs went through once they realized the best and brightest of us, quote unquote, were now being admitted into these large white institutions. They had to redefine their mission. They had to redefine our scope. One of the wonderful things, aside from whether you like him or don't like him, agree or don't agree, what Bill Cosby did single-handedly was save HCBUs.
Yeah,
single-handedly. So whatever his legacy may be, but one thing that cannot be minimized is the fact that HCBUs were dying. They were withering on the vine. There was no fund development for them. They were closing. He literally saved Fisk with a check, because when we toured Fisk, their generator had broke. They had no heat in their dormitories, and they couldn't afford to fix it. They had students sleeping in the bio lab because they would turn on the Bunsen burner so they could get heat. When I say HCBUs were in a desperate situation, they were in a desperate place. What he came up with as a plan was to say, we are going to create the Morehouses, the Fisk, the Howard, etc. We are going to put them on par with Princeton, Harvard, Yale, etc. We're going to create this as a dynamic space that you want to be in. We're going to create this as every Black child who graduates from college, high school, should want to go to an HCBU. How does he do this? He creates a show called Different World. How does he do that? Before that, he simply starts wearing t-shirts. I mean, brilliant. He started wearing
t-shirt. Yeah, in a shirt.
One week he'd have, Spelman. One week he'd have Princeton. Nothing to do with that. Just creating a relationship between the Harvards and Yales, the Morehouses, the Fisk, just to create a demand for it. Second thing he does is then create a show that highlights the advantages of going to an HCBU. I taught at Spelman in 86, 87. Of a 300 admission class, they could not field a freshman class of 300 students. They literally had 160 applications for 300 positions. 3 years later, after his work on Cosby Show, etc., they have 1,500 applications for 300. Directly attributable to the work that he did with that, directly attributable to Different World, and begins to leverage his relationships to make sure that Spelman has the first African-American woman president. Does it brilliantly by saying, I'm going to get Janetta Cole, a designated, and then I'm going to cast an actor, Gloria Foster, who looks and sounds exactly like Janetta Cole. When I tell you this stuff was worked out, that's what Black art can do. That's what it can do. Well, we are part of a larger conversation. Go ahead, Adai. I'm sorry.
No. I was going to say, because I'm thinking about the fact that, a part of the reason why I ended up going to Clark was because, and it was right at that time. It was essentially the year I started was the year that A Different World debuted. But the year before, Spike had done School Days. So between Spike and Bill shaping this idea of Black institutional excellence, absolutely. I don't think people realize how powerful that was. That's
right. And that art was used at the centerpiece of the economic redevelopment of a collegiate system. Right. Redefined the need for HCBUs in a climate when many people had options of going to. So now the best and brightest of us were saying, well, do I want to go to Harvard or do I want to go to Morehouse?
Exactly.
Do I want to go to Howard or do I want to go to Princeton? That was not a conversation 10 years before. It certainly was when HCBUs were the only thing that were available to us. So they had to redefine their mission in a certain sense and also redefine an approach. I think it's the same thing in terms of all Black arts and cultural institutions. That what our mission is now is probably evolved and morphed, given the fact that there are so many artists, have access in the predominantly white institutions, particularly if they're successful. They're an artist that institution wants to make an investment in. But what about everybody else? What about the menu of other work that's being done? Where do they work? And how is it that we create, again, these incubators, these spaces, these safe spaces for them to do work that, contributes to the landscape of African-American art? When we start talking about cultural diversity, white folks always say cultural diversity is who's the one or two I want to work with. When African-Americans say cultural diversity is what is the landscape by which we can all work and contribute. So we're having two separate conversations, and the conversation we're having is far more instructive in terms of the longevity of the culture. They're having a conversation about the longevity of their institution. They're different conversations, different agendas, and so they will, at some point, they intersect where there's an intersection of need, but at other point, they're just parallel trains working on parallel tracks. Someone would ask me, wouldn't you like to do, quote unquote, the canon of white work? I said, I haven't exhausted the possibility of black work yet. I haven't even scratched the surface of that. I ain't got time to do that.
We haven't even scratched the surface. I mean, literally, we're like this.
Right. We're here in terms of the depth and wealth of the experience. And what I'm not interested in is trying to take a kind of dead European aesthetic and put it on a respirator and charge new life in it because it has an African-American aesthetic running underneath it. No, I don't need to do that. I don't need to know that black people can the years ago when James Earl Jones was Big Daddy in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I didn't need that. I knew he could act already. There was nothing of proving ground to tell me that, and now I'm watching a play that makes no friggin' sense because you got these white kids looking at this big black man who's at the head of their dinner table and never acknowledging that race exists. And they're trying to convince me that it's colorblind. I said, but there's no evidence of that in the world that I live in. I see color. Hell, when I stop at a stoplight, I see red and green. I see color. And I recognize that it has a place and a designation. So you can't tell me you don't see color. Not in the next phrase, call me a nigga. I'm not buying it. So my job is to be part of a conversation that's about rearresting that imagination and having an informed conversation with those allies that say, yes, I am interested in the world of African-American art on its terms, not me co-opting it in cultural appropriation. And so it becomes very fine in terms of what is being culturally appropriated and what is legitimately kinds of collaborations that can exist between all kinds of institutions. But we have to be the architect of that conversation. We all too often are reacting to what they're giving us. We think it's like really beneficial that, the white folk gave me a job, right? And were you not deserving of that job? Right. So it's not about the job. It's about the work we're doing and how it's going to be represented. And if you don't feel comfortable having a conversation, I do, because my livelihood is not contingent and dependent on the generosity of strangers. I'm not Blanche Dubois. I don't need the kindness of strangers, and I don't need white folks to come tell me what it is that I can and cannot do. So now we're in a position to have a real conversation about Black art, knowing that I'm going to be a caretaker of it from having produced it for 30, 40 years, not because I'm interested in a job. We were talking about the development of a space in West End, and part of the people who we're bringing in are people who are not worried about a job. It's not about, about vanity. It's about legacy. What are we going to leave for our community, and what are we going to leave for those coming behind? And that's part of, as I was talking to T.C. Carson, and he was saying, I got about 25 good summers left. What am I going to do with them?
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So I have a question, because our conversation just went in a place that I wasn't expecting. So since we're here, I'm going to ask these questions, because as we're talking about Black institutions, and we think about a lot of the major ones here in Atlanta, but there are also a lot of small Black theater companies that have been doing a lot of work. I think specifically about New African Grove, and how literally they're one of 17 companies in the entire world that have done the entire August Wilson 10-play cycle, and no one realizes that they've done it. But they have like the certification and everything from it. So I'm wondering, how then do we also, as we're thinking about developing, not only them having their own canon, but also how do we support them in developing work and help them to kind of be able to cultivate their own kind of legacy and create spaces for the companies as well? Because I think that I mean, because they have definitely done new plays as well, but I'm thinking about the fact that most people overlook them, and often they're not funded, and they consider themselves to be a community theater, which I think is also fine to have community theaters too, because there are community theaters here in Atlanta that also kind of get some sort of clout. So my biggest question is, how do we continue to support institutions and kind of, because I feel like new play development also becomes new institution development as well, because if we develop the play and there's no place for them to go, and there's no theater company that's going to produce the work, then how do we also create those other avenues? So
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's a really great question. Couple of things. One, I don't think there's such thing as community theater. I think there's theater that serves a community. And so once we get out of that designation, then you stop letting people define as what's professional and what's not professional. Right? Every theater is a community theater. The Alliance Theater is a community theater. It's a theater that serves a community, And part of why I make that distinction is because funding and money is associated with those titles and with how you categorize yourself, what your budgets are. And so part of what we had to do was redefine the language and the linguistic, and we did it with the National Endowment. That was also saying, you're not X, Y, and Z. Saying, no, this is what we are. And so they were able to create things like, expansion arts that began to be more inclusive in the funding cycle and patterns to institutions. So part of what we have to do is having a conversation with these institutions and say, what is your institution? How do you view yourself as an institution? And what is your development? What are you really looking to see? If, the question I posed to a couple of folks, create your own cultural Wakanda. Forget race, forget sex, forget gender, forget money. What do you want to look like and exist as? Same work we do with the playwright. What play are you writing? You tell me what it is before I impose some judgment as to what track you should go. Tell me the playwright. What is the institution you're building? And how then we look at the menu of those needs and say, okay, maybe you don't need a managing director. Maybe you don't need a board. Maybe what you need is this kind of floating, a group of advisors that you can tap into on an ongoing basis in a number of different areas that gives you a kind of institutional mentorship in these various phases of marketing, et cetera, because at your core, this is who you are. I don't think institutions have necessarily had that kind of self-audit. So that's, I think, number one, pulling together that conversation. We also have to have a dual conversation with the larger landscape and say, the way in which your criteria for funding African-American art and the criteria is probably slanted and biased. So let's look at your funding patterns, how you're making decisions, why you're making those decisions, and put you now in partnership and in the same room with the very people who are making art. How is it then you can support them? Because they're not going to look like the Alliance Theater. They're not going to look like Horizon or Theatrical Outfit, and they're not supposed to. They're supposed to look like who they look like. Your job then is not to overlook them in terms of funding pattern, but to understand what that is. That's exactly what Michael Lomax did years ago before the creation of National Black Arts Festival, was he put funders, developers in the room with artists from all different stripes so they could have a conversation. So that then when our proposal was on the desk of Coca-Cola, they weren't summarily dismissing it because it didn't look like the proposal from the Alliance. They were saying, no, I understand what this is, and this fits perfectly with their mission, and we should support it for a whole menu of reasons because, again, a rising tide lifts all boats. So I think we have to be, those of us who are institution builders or concerned with institutions, beginning to have a conversation amongst those people who are running institutions. Have they sat in the same room and really laid out an agenda for themselves over the next 3 to 5 years? If they haven't, then we probably should. If they have, then we should all know about it and be able to say, how then do we make this manifest in terms of the marketplace? So that's kind of one. We were, Adinos, we were talking, and we were talking to artists and saying, during the quote unquote racial awakening, which is now people are going back to sleep on. Remember that racial pandemic way back in 2020? Oh, that was so August ago. So long ago. Oh man, was that way back in July? No, we've been through an election. We're good now. But way back when white folks said they cared about our viewpoint and our point of view, we were asking them for a job. What do you want? You want to work? No, that's not a plan. That's not an aesthetic. That's not a dream. That's chasing a job, not chasing a dream. And so I think what we have to do is say, what is the dream? What does the landscape look like? That's why I think all of us sat down as a collective body and put together a kind of document that said, no, this is what a cultural Wakanda looks like for us. And now we can have a more I think, a more detailed conversation with those partners outside of us, saying these are the kinds of things that are important in terms of institutional development, not only for the field, but also for specific institutions.
Right. So I've been trying to frame this racial awakening and this pandemic as an opportunity, as a potential way to shift some paradigms as it relates to especially institution building, but also new work development. What are some of the opportunities that you think the pandemic is providing us that we need to take advantage of?
Well, one, because we can't operate the way we did before. We've become far more creative and kind of ingenious in terms of how it is that we even create platforms for work. There was an article that came out in DC Metro that said there was a pandemic in the theater long before there was a pandemic. And part of, I think, what the notion of the article was that in terms of issues of audience engagement, in terms of the kind of dynamism of the work that we're presenting on stage, that all of this become really kind of mediocre. We've become lackluster in our approaches of creating and diversifying our audiences. We've become lackluster in even the kind of approach we do. We're making decisions in terms of the art that's on our stage as to pandering to who we think, how many people will come see it and buy a ticket to it, rather than the dynamism of the work that we're trying to do, and beginning to cultivate audiences to understand that there are different ways and means, so that every art doesn't look like the same thing. That's part of the first conversation of the pandemic. I think the opportunity is that we've all had to hibernate, and as Ralph Ellison said, hibernation is a covert preparation for a more overt act. That in fact, we've been forced to go indoors because we can't go into the state and say, in divine inspiration, y'all all need to sit down and take a rest and think about the world that you're living in and the kind of work that you want to do. And when you're able to go back outdoors, what that's going to look like. So it's forced people to almost do a self-audit. Who am I as an artist? What is my obligation to myself, to my community, to a larger culture? And now, what are the platforms and institutions that I want to use to make that happen? It's also forced us to talk to each other in a way and to be much more in communication with each other than we have been, which means it gives me the opportunity to understand what's on your mind, what's on my mind, where we have common ground, where we can collectively begin to build certain things, where we can create institutional support in terms of marketing, using social platforms, et cetera. So that's, I think, the first thing that's happened, is that we've gone insular. We've had to become more creative in terms of what we're doing. Hopefully we'll carry that ingenuity out into the rest of the world, and also to look at our long-term, survivability, if that's a word, because it's been put in jeopardy. Once everything that you have worked for can be taken away from you, you begin to say, well, now what measures can I put to make sure that that doesn't happen again? And not simply for me, but recognizing it's the whole industry. I am part of a community, and if the community doesn't survive, I don't survive. So now how is it that we begin to have those conversations, so that when we emerge out of this, we're using this time which has been afforded us, the vacation, in a sense, to have the kind of meaningful conversations we haven't had before. For us to sit even in a platform like this and even begin to deal with that question. I'm not sure we were doing that before the pandemic. I'm not sure we were having these kind of meaningful conversations across communities, and the fact is then what we come out of it is hopefully will be solution driven and then plan driven. Now we know that these are the things that we want to do, A, B, C, and D. What are the means by which we are able to make them manifest into the marketplace? How do we then go from just talking about it, putting it down on paper, to creating these strategic alliances and relationships, so that once we are able to come back outdoors, the world looks like and is reflective of the kind of workplace that we want to be in.
Right. And I think that's interesting, because we bring up, gosh, so many things we're bringing up here, but we bring up this idea about, because I hear the group that is talking about job security, and I understand that. And I hear the group that's also talking about institutionalism. And I'm wondering, how can we create a space where all of these voices can be there, so that we can say, hey, let's build some institutions and let's get people to invest in your professional development, so you don't feel like you have to go begging for a job. Well, begging is, I guess, not the best way of putting it, but saying, hey, because we recognize that people do need to work, or saying, hey, here's some grants that can kind of help to support you and fund you in your endeavors and your processes. And maybe you have several vocations, because I think all of us have had several vocations. Not all of my jobs come from theaters in any way, shape, or form. Right. And I like to eat. So, but I think the question becomes, how do we also kind of get people to understand that none of the conversations have to be the same, and we can be diverse in our mindset in a collective, and still support each other and still kind of encourage institutions and still encourage professional development and still say, hey, let's think long-term about all of it and how in 20, 25 years, we can be wherever we are. Because I always tell people, it's like, I love writing and I love helping out backstage, but in 20, 25 years, I want to be the person writing the checks like, here, go do this work. And that's my goal, is to get my people paid and to get people. That's my goal. So whatever I got to do to figure out how to help people, I'm here for it, because I think the biggest travesty is that some of my friends don't get a chance to do their work because they don't have the funding to do the work. And we're missing out on bright voices. But anyway, so all of that is like, how do we get people in the room and understanding that all of the voices do need to be in the room, and we can agree to disagree in the room, but that doesn't mean that we're not supporting each other and that we're not pushing for each other's excellence.
Mm-hmm. I think that's correct. I think things can, as you say, can mutually coexist. You know, that institutional development and personal development of a job are not they're not in absentia, and that they can run on parallel tracks. But isn't that what we've been doing? I mean, the work that we've all been doing in terms of even this coalition plan that we put together, this Black Action Arts Plan, is representative of that thinking. And that now all it is now saying what the next step from me is, and for all of us, is to say, this is the roadmap. This is the blueprint that we put together. So we did that already, you know, not knowing that we did that, but that's what we did. There is a plan on cultural literacy. There's a plan on performance. There's a plan on real estate development. There's a plan on cultural advocacy. And it came from the collective genius and the minds of all of those artists that were concerned with those things. So that now exists as a document that didn't exist before. Mm-hmm. Secondarily, now is saying, if this is, what's then the action plan to make sure that this thing, which represents the collective cultural Wakanda, how does we then put that into the marketplace? And that's the phase we're in now. You know, what we were talking about, you know, before we came on air, the development of now, there are Black land developers that are poised and saying, we want performing arts institutions as an arts narrative in the redevelopment of the economy in our community, that we're now having a conversation with. In very short order, we will have 2 to 3 spaces that will be serving the interest of Black performing arts consortium that didn't exist before. That only happened because of the racial pandemic and the fact that we said we need that. So I think we're in process. I think we are at the very beginning of that process of that happening. We talked a little bit before about if there's a space where, you know, as an artist over the next 3 years, every year I was guaranteed a slot to do whatever kind of work I wanted to do, and it wasn't going to cost me rent, that would probably change your incentive and your urgency in terms of doing the work. Well, that's what we're talking about doing. That's where the individual artist gets served and the institution gets served. I know that there's a space that I can do X, Y, and Z in my own new play development in whatever way I want, and I'm not going to be saddled with the cost of having to put that up. That creates a different kind of synergy of the Black person. It also makes the individual artist incentivized to say, now you have to think as an entrepreneur. Now you have to Jay-Z this. Now you have to, you know, you have to Beyonce this. You have to think, you know, I mean, the only reason they are who they are is because they say, I'm not about singing a song, I'm about creating an empire. And so what's the empire you're trying to create? But that's part of your responsibility, the individual artist, to look beyond your own narrow circumstances and say, I'm not interested in just working for the next 4 weeks. I'm interested in working for a lifetime. And what are the kinds of engines that I can create that begin to service me as I go out looking for the job? You know, I'm reminded of Eugene Russell, who says, I'm going to create my own album, my own thing, because not only am I a musician, but if I don't believe in my work and invest in it, why should somebody else? Mm-hmm. Now there's an avenue. I've got a project. I've got a music project. I can go to Eugene and say, hey, man, you want to do a live concert airing of your thing? We've got a space that you can use that's not going to cost you anything. That now, even in the age of COVID, you can bring 250 to 300 people in. That's a tangible conversation about the artist, their development, their work. It's moved out of the planning and theoretical stage into, we now want to address artists. What do you specifically need? There are these resources that we can provide, 1, from a space point of view, and 2, from a fund development point of view. And now, as you begin to actively look at, you know, fundraising for a particular project, you're fundraising for something that's going to be about your long-term development, not simply about just trying to get a job, while you go out and audition for this other stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's the way. Yeah.
I just want to highlight the Black Arts Action Plan, and at some point we're gonna have you and Marguerite and some other folks on, maybe around April, to talk specifically about that.
So in real life, I think over the next 30 days, and what we've talked about, and in fact, I just talked to Marguerite, is just to say by April we're going to have a ribbon cutting of all the artists that were a part of that plan at the space, at the new space.
Yeah.
You know, and that part of what they're also over the next couple of months, our conversations to say, I want you to think about your work. If you're an institution, if you're African Grove, or if you're Enoch King or Eugene Russell, or whomsoever, or the young people that said we wanted to have, to deal with this in-school young purpose performance. Okay, well maybe now we can work with you in terms of a space of bringing these kids into an open air space that's COVID friendly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how is it that we begin to use the resources of Black developers that are coming to us because of the racial pandemic and saying we now want to become much more active in cultural development? How do we then translate that conversation into empowering the artists around us so that they're not simply, as you're saying, not simply talking about the play or the job, which is necessary, but the old Irish accent, if you give a man a potato, you helped him, you fed him for a day. If you teach him how to farm, you fed him for a lifetime. So we have to about teaching people how to farm for a lifetime, while they work on eating for the day. And I think we're on our way to doing that.
Okay. Right. Well, I want to happen. So I know we got this is a great conversation. But I do want to say so because what we've asked of everybody is kind of their process, and what I'm hearing, and you can kind of fill in the blanks of what I might have missed, is that the process of, and in this case, we're talking about new institution development, which is very similar to new play development. So it's getting people together to first defining what it is that you're needing, getting in a room with people and having the conversation and putting together an actual plan, and then starting to work on executing that plan and getting investors and funders to come in on the plan that you've created, and then actually trying to build. And so is there any part that I missed? Is anything that you would add in addition to that part?
I think that incorporates it. Before you can ask the world to give you something, you have to know what you want the world to give you. And so that becomes vital, is you have to have a conversation with a real conversation with yourself. And you also have to have a certain degree of honesty. If Oprah could sing like Aretha, we'd know it by now.
Everything is your ministry. Everything is your ministry.
That's right.
If that is not your skill set, if you don't have that, then you are having a false conversation with yourself about your agenda. As my grandmama say, that ain't you, boo. That's just not you. Right. And so part of that needs assessment is, if you're unable to have a realistic conversation with yourself, then how do we facilitate that? In terms of saying what is it that you really at your core? It's the same thing when you work with a playwright, and you know this intimately. The playwright, I'm thinking of the last play you and I worked on, a guy with hands of color. When the playwright said, I want to end racism, we very easily said, well, that ain't gonna happen.
not in one play.
That's great. That play ain't gonna do that. That's what's gonna happen. So now, what are you really writing about?
Right.
And to get her to that, to really articulate in very plain terms, this is what this play is about. This is what the story is. Then you could begin to assist in helping her tell that story. We're not telling the story we want you to tell. What is the story you want to tell? And so I think it's the same kind of institutional dramaturgy that you're doing with those, and artistic dramaturgy they're doing with their own, their own self-assessment. That's great, but you're not Aretha. I don't see that happening in the next year or so, given the fact that you can't hold the pitch. So now let's have a conversation about
what you can do.
And what you can do. And what do you realistically want to do? Where did your passion lie? So then we can create some kind of strategy for moving you from here to there. But that's part of the ongoing candid conversation that we need to have with each other. And how we can be support for each other in a real way. That's the safe space, to be able not to say the things that you want to hear, but the things that need to be heard, and to allow you to articulate that. We're therapists in a larger sense. We're helping people really define at their core who they are and the kind of work that they want to do, because all of us are wounded. The only reason why you're an artist is because you're wounded and you wanted some place to go in and as Ron Milner told me years ago, I only write to and that's what art is, about a healing, and so usually some of us are in some particular condition, something that's afflicting us that turns to the art as a means of a solve to the wound. So, I mean, we get that. So now let's talk about how it is that you, by remedying that thing that afflicts you, other people bearing witness to that, if they're going through the same thing, it heals them because now they see a process of going through. Well, we have to do the same kind of institutional kind of work, asking the hard questions and being around to listen, as people begin to talk and then help them identify, when they say, well, I want to do, no, you said your story was this. So we want to help you. We want to help you realize your story. And I understand that idea, great idea. That's another play. Your story is what, as you went through it and could own it, you said, we didn't hand you your story. This is what you said your story was. So now let us help you tell that.
Right. Well, Tom, we can talk to your ass all day.
Yeah.
We also know
people I like.
We also know you got another check to collect in a couple of minutes.
Right.
So I just want to say, sir, thank you for being an institution builder, a mentor, an innovator, a troublemaker, all those things that make you the wonderful person that you are. You are greatly.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here. Again, it's always great. These are the things that heal us all, being able to be in community with each other and fellowship and sistership with each other and have conversations that are family conversations. So thank you for the opportunity. And I mean that really from the heart.
Love you, brother.
Yeah, hold on. Wait. You didn't ask him about the books. Wait.
Oh,
he don't.
Yeah. Oh, shit. That's right. Before you go, get your check. So we have the tradition now of asking folks about for a book or a play or a movie that would inspire them to stretch their craft, but also maybe inspire them to create new work.
Wow, 2 books. One, and they're not theatrically related. One is the Obama Diary, The Promised Land.
Oh, okay.
Which is just about watching the self-realization of someone, who speaks when the world is telling them no. And how, the idea of becoming president when the world said it wasn't possible, I think speaks to me personally about we are more often as artists going to hear no than we do yes. And how do you then begin to find your purpose in a world full of no's? That I think one. And the second thing is always my go-to, which is sold to Black folks, the boys.
Wow.
Classic. Always.
Classic.
I know
what you got for today. What you got today? Now, I was asking Amina, what's hers for today?
Okay, so I got organizations today because I've been doing some theater intimacy training and starting to kind of look into that. So one is the one that I really kind of want to highlight is the Intimacy Directors of Color. And they're starting, because theater intimacy has started out really talking mostly about sexuality and how to re-choreograph sex in a safe space in theater, but they're talking specifically about how to also have the same kinds of conversations about race and trauma, especially because a lot of our work is heavy and we sometimes re-traumatize our actors or re-traumatize people. And so how then do we think sensitively without necessarily censorship, but actually saying these are the weight of the words that we're seeing, and there needs to be a placeholder here. And so I want to shout out Intimacy Directors of Color for the workshop that I just did on Monday with them and some of the work that they're doing.
Oh, cool.
Nice.
So mine would be, so the great Puerto Rican institution builder, Miguel Algarin, just passed away yesterday. He started the New York Poets Cafe in New York City, which was like the groundswell for tons of spoken word artists, but it's where Miguel Pinero started. So I was rewatching the film Pinero, which is fucking brilliant, with Benjamin Bratt playing Miguel Pinero.
That's a beautiful movie.
And Giancarlo Esposito plays Miguel Algarin. So if you have never seen Pinero, find it, watch it. It's extraordinary.
It really is. I co-sign that. Yeah, that is. Yeah, and Benjamin Bratt. That's when everybody realized, oh, he really can act. And as you said, Pinero is one of those lost artists, and Short Eyes was just a brilliant piece of work. in terms of diversity, his work, Baraka and Sonia and with Short Eyes helped put Joe Papp on the map in terms of cultural development.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah. So, anyways, good people.
Thank
Love
you,
you
Tom. Love you. Thank you so much. You're so awesome.
We'll talk real soon. Yeah. Thanks, folks.
Thanks. Woo.
Woo.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and finish this up and talk about the last couple of things we need to talk about today. I wanted to make sure that we also highlighted some of the upcoming Black events that are going to be happening, so that people know, because we are, if nothing else, in terms of new play development, also trying to make sure that we always are supporting people. So I'm just going to share a couple little things with us. First thing I want to recognize Interface Theater. They're a new theater company, and they got a grant from Fulton County Arts also, and they commissioned 6 playwrights of color to come forward and to develop some new work. So we are super excited. They're this weekend, December 4th through the 6th. Their tickets are free. There is a suggested donation of $10, but definitely support whatever funds that you send will also go toward the actual artist. So go ahead and, help the artist get, eat a little bit by letting them have that. And we also have some wonderful directors and some people who we hope to have on the show at some point later on. So just know that. And then I do want to point out that the Boulevard has project grants. So if you are an artist and you are looking for for a grant, I think this grant is up to $1,000. Don't quote me on it, but go ahead and take a look at it. Taryn owns the Boulevard, which is kind of a space where people can come together and start kind of supporting and doing some professional development for theater artists. And so we want to make sure that we highlight them. And also, and I couldn't find the flyer, I just found the submission flyer, but BLACT, which is Black Leaders Advocating for Cultural Theater. I think I got that right. They'll let me know later if I messed it up. I think I got it completely right. But they actually had a submission, a short film submission that just finished on November 30th. And I think they're going to be screening their videos coming up December 6th through the 8th. And as soon as we find that, we'll post that on the wall to make sure. But I do want to make sure that we know that there's new play developing here in Atlanta. And we want to make sure that we are supporting all these persons who are trying to do their work. And we'll try to help shout some other people out too, because we want to make sure that we're all supporting. So anything else you got, Adaye?
No.
Wow.
Go support some Black art, y'all.
Please go to support some Black art, and a lot of it right now is online. So if you need something to do over the weekend, please make sure that you do check those things out. But otherwise, this has been Hush Harbor Lab. This was the Blue Bottle series. We want to thank the Fulton County Arts and Culture, and I do want to do one shout out because this is the last one that's listed on the flyer for now, but this won't actually be the last one because we're still in conversation, trying to get some other artists on, really trying to get other people who are developing new work and developing new institutions and empires too, because clearly we have created an awesome space for that. But we also do want to shout out Martinique Mix, who has done our flyers for this, and she does our flyers for pretty much everything. And so we are super grateful for her and the work that she does. And we're just super grateful. And thank you again, Tom Jones, for being on today. But just stay tuned. Oh, last thing, and I didn't even upload your flyer. Oh man, that's so terrible. I upload everybody else's flyers. This is the last thing I promise. Adaye Moon's workshop reading of his new play Ezekiel's Will be on December the 13th. It is also a free reading. Note that it is a workshop, so he's in the process of writing the play right now.
But a workshop.
And so we are fussing with him about the new play process at the moment. And so I'm gonna try to get him on to talk about how much we fuss about this, but just know, come back out December 13th. And you do need to sign up for that. It is going to be closed because we do want to make sure that he can be secure, and because it's going to be a new play. We want to be able to have a good, honest conversation to help him get to the next level. But we go into lab next week for that, and we're super excited about the lab. Gary Yates will be directing. Lexi McKay will be our stage manager. And we have a list of cast who is going to be really awesome, and they're going to make this pop. So Adaye, you are up next, so I hope you are ready to go through our own lab.
I'll be ready.
Well, thank you all so much. Goodbye, good evening, and we will see you all later.
Peace.